First of all, thank you all very much for coming. It's fun to see a full room. That's pretty exciting. So as Amy said, I'm a philosophy professor here at WSU, and I get to be the moderator. So they told me that I should sit in the middle and keep things cool, which they probably will be. So why are we here tonight? Well, to give you a sense for what we have in mind, I've actually got a quote from a philosopher named John Dewey. That's from a book he wrote in 1929 called The Quest for Certainty. Here's what Dewey said. He said, "The deepest problem of modern life is that we have failed to integrate our thoughts about the world with our thoughts about value and purpose." The deepest problem of modern life is that we've failed to integrate our thoughts about the world with our thoughts about value and purpose. And so, in many respects, what I think we're hoping to do tonight is to provide a context where we can do some of that integrating. And as it turns out, two of the most prominent conversation partners in a discussion or a dialogue about the world and about value and purpose are probably going to be science and religion. Right? Science is probably one of the most powerful sources of knowledge we have in the modern world. And religions could make a claim to being one of the longest standing sources of knowledge we have. And so our hope tonight is to, in some ways, bring them into conversation with one another through what we're doing. So I'm going to turn it over at this point to Troy Van Voorhis. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks for having me. This is actually my first visit to Washington State University. It's been great. I'm here today because I belong to a group that has something of a, well, shall we say, a reputation. So members of my group often claim that by contemplating certain unseen truths, we can come to a better understanding of the world around us. People who adhere to my tradition also claim that if you follow the teachings of this tradition, you can be cured of certain rather serious illnesses. As a result, adherents of my tradition are often mistrusted and sometimes even viewed with disdain in certain circles. And I'm, of course, speaking about my status as a chemist. Maybe some of you thought I was going to say something else, but no, in fact, chemistry asks you to believe in certain unseen things, like little molecules that you've never been seen with the naked eye that influence the world around us. They try to convince you that if you take the right small amounts of certain compounds, it will cure things like syphilis, gonorrhea, bronchitis, whatever ails you. But at the same time, because chemists are responsible for things like pesticides, preservatives in food, and things like carcinogens like BPA, chemists are commonly viewed with mistrust publicly. We're in fact probably one of the least well-regarded scientific disciplines. So I am unfortunately sad to report that I am a chemist, but I am also a Christian. And I'm here today to discuss this big question, why are we here? But before I get into that, I want to lay to rest at least one popular misconception about how science and Christian faith interact. As many of you know, Christian faith has a lot to do with the things that we believe. And so I wanted to touch on a couple of things that people believe about science, just as illustrations of things you might believe. So on the left here, I have an illustration of something that people believe. So it turns out that 20% of the American population believes that vaccines, childhood vaccines, are linked to autism. That's a belief about science. It turns out about 37% of the American populace believe that global warming is a hoax. So those are two beliefs that people have about science. Now, the misconception that I want to lay, these are now a particular kind of belief. They're a belief about observable facts. Either global warming is or it isn't. And the misconception seems to be that the disagreement between Christianity and science is actually at the level of observable fact beliefs like this. So if I was to state the misconception, it's that Christianity means that you can't believe in fill in the blank with some topic. And there seems to be a list of these topics, things like the age of the universe, the origin of species, whether the Earth revolves around the sun or the sun around the Earth. And the idea seems to be that there's a list of these things, and the difference between science and faith boils down to which description of events you believe is true. So scientists believe the Earth is so many years old, Christians believe something else. Scientists believe in trilobites, Christians don't. Scientists root for the 49ers, Christians root for the Seahawks. And unfortunately, this is not an accurate characterization either of scientific thought or Christian faith, because Christian faith doesn't involve endorsing some creed of facts about the created universe. Rather, the role of faith is to help us figure out what to do with our observations. Likewise, science is more than just observable facts. That might come as a surprise to some of you. So this is a quote from Henri Poincaré. It says that he said that science is made of facts, just as houses are made of stone, so science is made of facts. But a pile of stones is not a house, and a collection of facts is not necessarily science. You see, science is the business of interpreting observations, giving them shape and meaning. And we're here tonight to talk about that kind of meaning. And one of the challenges is that in talking about meaning, we actually aren't usually talking about just one thing. Rather, in answering any single question, there are typically many different layers of meaning that one could tease out in the answer. For example, if we take the title of our forum, Why Are We Here? Well, this question actually reminds me of a story. So the story is this. There was a father who was lying down in the grass next to a river with his 8-year-old daughter, and they were staring up at the sky, watching the clouds pass by. And his daughter asked this question. She said, "Dad, why are we here?" And he said, "Well, we're here to enjoy beautiful days like this and to contemplate the vast universe, the beautiful sky, the babbling brook, the singing of the birds. And we're to contemplate the fact that in this vast universe we are not alone, but that there is a God who loves us and cares for us, and that our purpose is to love that God back and to love others so as to bring him glory." And she said, "Dad, you didn't answer my question." And he said, "No?" She said, "No. What I mean is, why are we here? It's 5 o'clock, and Mom told us to pick her up at 4:30. So there are different layers of meaning that you can give in answering any single question. And I think this is one of the things that actually happens in terms of the ways that science, faith, philosophy, these things, we often are talking at cross purposes because we mistake the fact that we are actually talking about different layers of meaning to sometimes the same question. So I hope that in the discussion we'll be able to flesh some of these things out and make sure that we're answering the same questions. The same logic, the idea that there's different layers of meaning, I think applies to virtually all important questions. If there's really only one answer to the question, it's probably not a very important question. So for example, getting back to the two different categories of things that Bill brought up in the introduction, I've got two different groups of questions here. So on the right here, I've got a group of questions. The questions are, how many chromosomes do humans possess? Why is this heat engine so darn inefficient? And does the neutrino have mass? These are all boring questions because they have clear answers. There's only really one answer to these questions. These are the kinds of questions that science usually starts from. But what science does is it takes answers to these boring questions and it builds up a framework that gives us some form of meaning, some way of interpreting the world around us. Likewise, I can go over here and ask another set of questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What do I value? These questions are also boring for the opposite reason, and it's very hard to get data about these things. Hard to do control experiments about who I am. And they're also a bit narcissistic. They're all about me, me, me. So these are kind of boring questions by themselves, but what philosophy does is it starts from a set of answers to these kinds of questions, and it builds some sort of a meaningful framework based on answering questions like this. And so philosophy is starting from those questions, and it's moving towards the right. Science is starting from those questions and moving towards the left. And they meet in the middle. And the middle there is where the interesting discussions are to be had. Because that's where the questions that really matter for our lives happen. So to understand how this works, I want to give just one case study example, and that has to do with pharmaceuticals, drugs. So suppose that I, as a chemist, were to discover a new drug, and I was able to show that this new drug actually cures breast cancer in mice. And what is more, suppose that I find no significant side effects, so the drug cures the breast cancer and the mice live long, happy little mouse lives afterwards. And that's my data, okay? That's my answer to the boring questions. Now, the interesting question comes, because if I have that data, would I then be justified in proceeding to do a clinical trial of that drug in humans? Well, this is an interesting and important question because it interacts with my data, the things that are on the right-hand side here, but it also interacts with my values, the things of who I think I am, why I think I'm here. And the things I value are going to actually influence what I do here. So for example, if I think I am here to become a very famous scientist and make a lot of money, that might influence me to try the clinical trial. It might influence me to even be a little bit reckless about this. And we, might laugh a little bit internally, oh yeah, you want to be famous and make a lot of money. But, they did a survey of the incoming freshman class at MIT, and they asked them, what are the things that are most important to you? And they gave a list of 20 options. And the number one thing that they said was important was they wanted to become famous scientists or engineers. That was number one. And number two was they wanted to make a lot of money. So out of 20 things, that was number one and number two for the MIT incoming class. So there certainly are people for whom that appears to be part of their answer to who they are and why they are here. And so there are some values that might make me reckless, but instead, if my core value is preserving all human life, I might still be motivated to try a clinical trial, but I might be more cautious about it. So to put it colloquially, if science is over here and philosophy is over here, then I am somewhere there in the middle, in that middle ground. And the difficulty is, in this region where science and philosophy interact, it can often be a stalemate. So philosophy might say one thing, science might say another, and how are we to decide which one is right? How do we adjudicate? And in fact, I suspect if I polled the room right now and I asked you guys, well, which one should I trust more? Should I trust my scientific understanding or my life philosophy in terms of guiding decisions? I think if I asked you guys that, we might get a fairly divided vote. And so it's actually a difficult question. And this, to me, is the place where faith, in particular for me, Christian faith, is very important in the intellectual exercise. Because the Christian worldview gives us a very particular lens through which we observe both the world, the universe around us, and through which we construct our life philosophy. And so when Jesus was here on earth, he taught mainly in parables. Now, these parables were intended to explain these kinds of problems, and they involve mundane things like farmers and sheep and rocks and seeds. And he used these parables these parables were about the world that we can see, and he used them to try to explain something about a world that people could not see. And this world that people couldn't see he called the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. And in this kingdom of God, everything that we thought ought to be true, or that ought to be, actually was. So there was this kingdom of God, but at the same time, Jesus taught the rather radical notion that this kingdom of God wasn't just in our minds, and it wasn't just some separate thing that was completely apart from the reality that we know. Instead, he taught that the kingdom of God is within our grasp, that all the things we could see were active in the things that we couldn't, that they were active in here, in the region in which we have to make our decisions. And so you see, Jesus was actually painting a picture like this that says, okay, well, where is the kingdom of God in my diagram? Well, the kingdom of God is somewhere out here. It encompasses our life philosophy, our science, and us. We are all part of that kingdom. And faith, what Jesus taught us somehow, was the way that we were supposed to participate in this kingdom. And this is important to me because it says to me that when there's apparent conflict here between, say, my life philosophy and my scientific observations, these conflicts ought to be able to be resolved, because the same God who created the universe also defines what ought to be in this kind of a framework. And Jesus' fundamental teaching is that when we place our faith in this kind of truth, it has the power to change us and the people who live in this uncomfortable middle ground. And this change is very important to me because this tension between what I value and I observe and what I observe runs right through the center of my person. So, for example, I have a lot of moral maxims that I'm sure are true. Things like, do unto others as others would do unto you, don't lie, turn the other cheek. I believe all these things are true, and yet I'm constantly disappointed by my inability to live up to these maxims. So, for example, take prayer. So, as a Christian, I think prayer is very important. It's very high up there. Email, on the other hand, not so high on my priority list. I don't think it's really essential to my life that I answer email. But if you ask me how many times a day I pray versus how many times a day I check my email, I would refuse to answer your question because the answer would embarrass me. Because I have something that I believe, but I have trouble living up to it. And you see, the problem for me is that I don't just need to learn what is true. I don't just need to learn right from wrong or whether the neutrino has mass or not. I need a truth that can change the way that I am. Truth that can make me be the person I think I ought to be. And I have found that just knowing a moral code is not enough. Or even just believing that a moral code is correct is not enough. Beyond that, faith in a God that's a watchmaker also is not enough. It doesn't accomplish the kind of transformation that I'm looking for. Because if God just, created the universe, set it in motion, then set up a sign that said, be back in 25 billion years, well, if he did that, then I'm kind of stuck, at least for the next 10 billion years. Whatever I am during that period is whatever I am. And most religions actually are even less help on this point because they say, yes, you can be accepted by God, but only if you perform, only if you accomplish a certain set of tasks or can adhere to a certain set of rules. It's only in Christianity that God actually provides the means for us to make this change. Because as Christians, we believe in a God who set the universe in motion, who defined right and wrong, but also sent for us the means of salvation. For the salvation for these people who were stuck in the middle. And that salvation came in the form of a person, the person of Jesus. And as Christians, we're convinced that when we place our faith in Jesus, that he comes to live in us. And that what I fundamentally believe in is his power to change me, to change the way that I am, to make me into the person that I fully believe that I ought to be. And so then getting back to the question that we started with, why are we here? Why am I here? I believe in my worldview that we are here both to become the people that we ought to be and also to be citizens of a kingdom that is much bigger than we thought that it was. Not just a kingdom of self, not just a kingdom of science, but a kingdom of God. So that's my worldview, and I'll now hand it off to Michael, and he'll let you know about what his worldview is.
We had dinner earlier. You guys can hear me, yeah? In the back? Okay. We had dinner earlier, and I was talking with Troy, and he's done a few of these, and now I see, wow, quite polished. It was pretty impressive. So unfortunately, that was a tough act to follow. I'm going to give it a go. The title of the forum is Why Are We Here? And Troy actually hit on one of the issues that I'm looking at. This question, to quote a Republican nominee, perhaps, is huge, right? And more than that, it's ambiguous. There are several different things that it can mean. And I like the way that Troy put, we could quibble what philosophy does, but the way he put it was actually kind of clever. And in a lot of ways, science and philosophy does the same sort of thing. We look at huge questions like this, and we try to make them a little simpler and see if that can help. See if we could extrapolate something. So I switch it to, why am I here? That's a little more tractable for me. If I try to imagine why everybody's here, that would be harder. Why am I here? Well, Bill asked me. I'm betting you're not satisfied. Okay, fair enough. Why am I here? Well, let me take you back a few years. If you go back from my birthday exactly 9 months, it's my mother's birthday. So why am I here? Date night. Okay, I'm betting you're still not quite satisfied. I'm betting you're going, yeah. But what was there a plan behind this? And I'm going to go, actually, not so much. I was an accident. So this seems problematic in some regards. So you start asking, well, no, does this mean that your life has no meaning? I'm going to go, no, actually not. My life does have meaning. It's got a bit of meaning. Now, what sort of meaning do I mean? Now, of course, you already know this is Christian versus atheist. You know which side of the process of deduction. You figured out what I am. Okay? So, let's start. What gives my life meaning? So I imagine they didn't figure it out that night, my mom's birthday. They figured it out a little later that I was about. Let's go ahead and say, that's when I kind of came into existence. All right? That's me. You can tell it's me because it will be uncanny resemblance. Okay. There I am. When they found out about me, I meant something. I meant something to them. Perhaps I was a huge anxiety. Ah, crap, we got to start saving for college. Perhaps they felt some warmth. Perhaps they said, this actually was a product of date night. So I developed relationships with my parents and family. And I meant something to them there. Even if it was the fact that, when you're an infant, infants are all right, but I prefer them once they get to 6 months because, let's face it, before 6 months, they're just doorstops, right? Okay, I was a little more than a doorstop, but I still meant something to my family. Eventually, I grew up, started hanging out in preschool. I developed some friends. In fact, I have a friend, I don't even remember when I met him, actually. Neither one of us remembers exactly when we met each other. We've been friends our whole lives. This person and I, we have meaning. There's meaning that's developed there. Well, then you go a little further. I get into school, I got teachers. I meant something to those teachers. It may have just been a paycheck, but I meant something. Eventually, I grew up, colleagues, work buddies, army buddies, developed meaning. It goes on and on. My students, some of you are in this room. You should be working on something, I'm sure. But I mean something to you, and you guys mean something to me. It's not one way. I want to make that clear, right? I mean something to Troy now. I'm his interlocutor tonight. All right? And even all of you, right? I'm that guy up on stage talking about crazy stuff. That's me. That's what I mean. So this is meaning. Okay? Now, how you might still ask, yeah, that's meaning, but what is the value in that? Well, the value is I want to try to make sure all of these relationships are as good and as healthy as possible. Just like Troy suggested, I want to try to live this sort of good life. And good life doesn't mean hedonism or self-centeredism. It means developing these relationships, being the person that I ought to be to all of these people, to the best of my ability. That's what's meaning to me. And life does have meaning. And curiously enough, this isn't that ephemeral. Maybe some of you after tonight, maybe you'll go enjoy a beverage and you'll forget all about me. Okay? But believe it or not, meaning can last a lifetime in a lot of cases. Even in cases where I haven't met somebody. This is my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, Lehman Barnes, Navy war hero. Well, I don't know if he's kind of a hero to me. Okay? Lehman Barnes. He died about 6 years before I was born. Never met him. But my mother was named Leamanda. She was named after Lehman here. I heard a lot about him. He used to call her his little stinker, and she developed a skunk collection, little toy skunks, as a result of this. This man, even though I've never met him, has meaning for me my entire life. I could go on, but I shan't. All right? Still, notice that I've answered a few questions. I've tried this why am I here a few times, and I've pushed it. But I still think you could reasonably ask another question. You could ask, yeah, it lasts a lifetime. It might even last past my lifetime. Okay? Like Lehman here. Lehman lasted past his lifetime, and it'll last throughout my lifetime. But you might say, well, what about something more? Something much, much more. A sort of cosmic significance. And I think I just did Google image searches in this regard. And I think these are the sort of views we've got, or at least the popular version on one side. Notice that says existential angst. And if you can read it, right here is Jean-Paul Sartre. He's a French philosopher. His Nausea, okay? It's all about the world just kind of crushing down on you to recognize the meaningless of your own life. And it's often called existential angst. If you could read this, it says, ruining young minds since 1939. Okay? But is there going to be cosmic significance? I'm going to try my best to build healthy relationships, to do what I can with all those relationships. It's possible one of the articles I've written, perhaps the one I co-wrote with Bill, will last a while. I'm going to go ahead and say it's more likely because I looked up Troy's citation counts. In other words, the number of times he's been cited. I've been cited 9 times. He's been cited 8,000 times. Okay, but I'm new. I just want to point this out. I'm new. Okay? But right now I'm going to put money on him to be remembered in 100 years. But even in 500 years, the way science is moving right now, it's likely he'll be a footnote. And I don't mean that. He does a lot of amazing work. But that's how fast science is going. In 500 years, little more than a footnote. I probably won't even be remembered. What about 1,000 years? 2,000 years? Oh God, I actually saw somebody's face in the audience. They looked like existential angst there. Okay? Yeah, it's not going to last long. So, as an atheist, how do I deal with this? There's a couple ways we can look at it. Here's a common atheistic claim. You look up there. Cosmic significance. And I called this, when Troy and I were first talking, I said this question of why are we here, it's kind of predictable in some senses, and unsatisfying. It's predictable because one thing you might look at is a naive atheist. No, there is no cognitive significance. Life is meaningless because nothing is eternal. To my mind, that's a pretty dim view, and actually begs the question. Begs the question in philosophical terms means it uses circular logic. That's what it's doing. I'm basically assuming the answer to my question if I were a naive atheist. It seems that the theist can easily say, we believe there is something eternal. And you have not given us a reason to think otherwise. And you know what? They're right. I can't just state there's nothing eternal. That's not a good reason. I mean, that's what I believe. Troy believes differently. One of us is wrong, but I'm betting we're both reasonable in this regard. Then the other one is, which I think is better, is no, but that does not show that life is meaningless. This is what's meaningful. In fact, the life being so short and not so eternal makes it that much meaningful that I maintain these relationships in these regards. And I imagine, and I have no idea why the numbers didn't work out. It worked out well on my original computer. But I imagine that the theist is going to say, fair enough. But that meaning pales in comparison to the meaning that one gets with a special relationship to God. And I agree. If there is a God, I agree that that would pale. Okay? Now, I've gone through the naive atheist and the better atheist. And I notice that there's still responses that it seems the theist can respond. Well, I'm going to look at the theist claims. There's a naive version. Definitely, one's relationship with the divine is potentially eternal, right? Immortal souls, God's eternal. You can have that relationship with God forever, building it up and up and up. That's absolutely right. But once again, it begs the question. The atheist is just going to say, we don't believe in such a thing, and you haven't given us a reason to think otherwise. See how it works both ways? There's a symmetry there. Well, of course, yeah, so the whole slideshow is messed up. But the next one, and I think this is interesting, there is a divine plan which each of us plays our respective parts. You know, trust me, I have a purpose here. God, the sort of sticky note that's left for us, if you have this view. Okay? And, you know, that's fair, but once again, to an atheist, we sit here and we say, yeah, okay, as long as you're not like Dawkins. we say, yeah, okay. But it's still a little unsatisfying to us because we say, if such a plan were to exist, our finite minds cannot have access to that plan. It'd be like, yes, if I play I suck at chess. But if I play a grandmaster in chess, he's going to destroy me. Do I know he has a plan? Yes. Does it mean anything to the game? No, I'm getting destroyed. Okay? I don't have access to that plan. Much the same way, if there is a God and that God has a plan, I don't understand how that can give meaning in this way, just knowing there's a plan when I don't have access to get that plan. So, there's some questions here, and I don't think that this is what we need to talk about. But notice that these questions seem to have a back and forth. Does God exist? What's the predictable answer? Troy says yes. I say no. Predictable. If God does exist, does that being have a plan? Well, this is interesting. I'm betting that there might be some theists in this room that actually say maybe God doesn't. We could haggle over what plan means. But it's another logical step to say that God does indeed have a plan. Just to say there is a God does not entail there is a plan. Okay? That's a question to ask, and once again, predictable. If there is a plan, can we derive meaning from that plan without having access to that plan? That's something that interests me. It's not a gotcha question. It's just, how do we deal with that? And I'm betting the answer to this is something like faith. Now, what we mean by faith, we can mean a bunch of different things. Some of which, and this is where I get off the Dawkins train, I think are eminently reasonable for someone to be theist, even though it's reasonable for me not to be. Can faith provide some reason to believe? And another way to put this is it the case? Because Troy and I have probably attended to most of the arguments for the existence of God and against the existence of God. And let me go ahead and give you this spoiler. If someone says they've proved that God exists, or they say they proved that God doesn't exist in the same way I could prove that 2 + 2 = 4, they're overstating their case. Okay? So the question is, given that we have access to a lot of the same evidence, can we reasonably disagree? Even though one of us is wrong, we might not know who it is. Can we reasonably disagree? That's all I've got. Thank you.
All right. So I've got a few questions, and as I said earlier, we want to give an opportunity really for Troy and for Mike to engage in dialogue with one another. So I'm going to start us off with a question that maybe is on the tip of a few tongues out in the audience. Some people have the suspicion that science sort of tells us everything we need to know about the world. And the picture it gives is a dour one. And I don't think anyone has articulated that more clearly than Richard Dawkins. So here's a quote from Richard Dawkins that I'd like both Troy and Mike to respond to. This is Dawkins. "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." So, Troy and Mike, I'm wondering if you think this is the right lesson that we should read off of a scientific understanding of the natural world.
Well, so it's a spoiler, no. But I think that the way that I would phrase it is that you could take Dawkins' quote there and turn it on its head and say, okay, well, it's the universe as we observe it is I think as Michael said, there is the possibility for reasonable people to disagree over this. And so just as Dawkins can look at the scientific evidence and see a world that has no design, no purpose, no good, no evil, a perfectly reasonable person could look at the same data and see a world that has design, that has purpose, that has good and evil, and that has some concern in its creation. And so I think that's one of those things where I think Dawkins is definitely attributing something to science that is science plus something else that he's adding to it. So
All right, yeah, actually, so Troy and I talked about this one, and at first Troy's like, I think we might agree on this one, and we do in a lot of ways. I think Dawkins is wrong to say there's no good, no evil in the world, or no good, no bad. And in fact, there's plenty of good reasons to think that maybe science doesn't have all the answers. Not saying it isn't one of the best knowledge-producing disciplines of all our times. I'm a philosopher of science and a fan of science. I want to make that clear. Okay? But it's not the case that we have good detectors yet. It's not the case that we have evil detectors. So science isn't going to be able to talk about that. There's a lot left after science. Now, of course, as an atheist, you might say, why do you believe there is good and evil in the world? Now, I don't believe there's a design necessarily. I'm going to go ahead and say that. That's where Troy and I might differ. But I do believe there is good and evil in the world. And you might say, why is that the case? Because there's a lot of naive atheists and naive theists that will say things like, without a God acting as a moral lawgiver, then there can't be moral laws. And that's just not true. Notice what I said provided meaning. It was relationships. The second we have a world that has relationships like that, there are obligations. There's good ways you can maintain those relationships. There's bad ways that you can maintain those relationships. These are moral laws, and I believe there are actual moral laws. But I also believe there are laws of nature that are not lawgivers, like the law of gravity. I don't believe that there was a lawmaker for that. Much like I don't believe there was a lawmaker for the law that I should probably not kill people. So this is the interesting case, right? Do you need to believe in God in order to believe there's good and evil? I say no. These things fall out of the way the universe is put together. I use that loosely, obviously.
You mentioned good detectors a second ago, and you said we don't have them yet. Do you think we ever will? Is that something science can...
You know what? Scientists, they're clever. Did you see his PowerPoint slide? Clever, clever, clever. So I leave it open that there might be a good detector, but actually no. I'm skeptical. I mean, let's face it. I want to go ahead and keep my job. You know, we philosophers, we talk a lot about ethics. So I want to keep my job, so no, scientists can't handle that, yeah.
Troy, my sense is that in your response, you're thinking that Dawkins has sort of gone beyond a commitment to methodological naturalism and brought in a whole bunch of value-laden concepts when he says there's no good, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between your day job, where I think you do have to be a methodological naturalist. You have to be committed methodologically to only natural phenomena. So you don't explain the interaction of chemical particles by saying God made them come together or something like that, right? So what is the relationship between your day job, if you will, and your faith? And how do those two fit together?
Right, so I think the fact that you have to be committed to so methodological naturalism is just the idea that, well, so there's naturalism, which would say that the natural world is all that we can see is all that there is, which is the kind of point of view that Dawkins is saying in the extreme there. Methodological naturalism is the somewhat weaker point that says, okay, well, maybe the natural world isn't all we can see, but as a natural scientist, when I'm doing chemistry experiments, I have to look for explanations that only exist in the natural world. So I have to operate as if the natural world is all that I see. That's just sort of the contract that we have in chemistry. That's how we explain things. But that doesn't mean that ideas don't pop into your head just of their, unbidden. You sort of sit here thinking and saying, well, this is really amazing how this works out. I would never have thought that this would have worked out as well as it does, but it does. And the sort of wonder at those kinds of things is certainly something that, for me, at least, is inspiring towards towards awe and wonder towards a creator of the things that I'm observing. Now, of course, for someone who is not a theist, that just is, it's just, wow, that's really neat. End of the story. But for me, there is a connection there that exploring the natural world is actually a way of saying, well, if this is part of God's creation, just in the same way that moral laws or whatever, exploring those things can give you some insight into God. Exploring this natural world gives us some insight into what God is doing or might be doing. This plan that we certainly can't know all of. It's like, well, can we know some of it? I think science does give us some ideas about what kind of plans God might or might not have had for the universe.
I wonder if you could say more about that.
Well, I mean, well, again, that gets down to the question of you can ask questions about the origins of the universe and the origins of life and these kinds of things, and scientific evidence has. There are scientific questions that and scientific data that actually has impact on how we understand those kinds of things. So, it's just nothing more than that, I think.
Mike, do you have any thoughts on the relationship between methodological naturalism and the sort of what Dewey called earlier, not just our thoughts about the world, but our thoughts about value and purpose?
Well, that questions could be taken a few different ways. Do I think there's a relationship between value and science, for example? Yes, actually I do. It turns out our ethical values may actually make a difference as to how confident we are that we know something at a particular time. For example, who here knows who Nate Silver is? Well, you can, 2 people? Okay, so Nate Silver, he's actually does a pretty good job at predicting things. And, when Nate Silver says that it's 95% likely that Washington's going to go blue in the next presidential election, that's actually a really good reason to believe that Washington will go blue in the next election, if our evidence is such that it's 95% likely. However, if I'm testing a new drug, and that new drug, I'm only 95%, I say to you, here's a new drug, and I'm 95% confident that it won't cause spontaneous decapitation. I'm betting most of you are going to go, do you know it's going to cause spontaneous decapitation? Sure, why not? You're going to say, no. We actually have we sort of have a higher standard, sometimes based on our ethical values. And science, of course, can also relate to our values. If it turns out through science we learn that there's certain ways that we could behave better, that's wonderful, okay? And that can actually, so science can influence ethics, and ethics can influence science. Value can influence science, science can influence value. Now, there was something interesting, and I'm going to go off, and this is why I think, even though I'm an atheist, I think one can be a reasonable theist. I think it's reasonable. I'm not someone who's going to sit here and say theism, if you're theistic, you must hate science. It's clearly false, right? So I listened to what Troy said, and he says when he looks at the world and all of a sudden things are going together really well. And he says the atheist is going to go, wow, that's neat. And that's really exactly what I do. But he says it starts to actually sort of reinforce his own conviction and faith. I think his earnestly held faith. And it's possible that there's something called, that perhaps faith is a faculty. Okay? It's not believing without good reason. I actually think Troy has good reasons to believe the way he does, and I have good reasons to believe the way I do. And if faith is actually a faculty, such that when you look at these things, it hits you with awe, and it starts to reveal bits of the divine to you, well, that's great. It turns out I'm somebody who's blind. I don't have that thing. But Troy may have that thing. It may be the case that Troy doesn't have that thing, and I'm not blind. Okay? Don't know which one of us is absolutely right at this moment. But my point is, interestingly enough, I found that really interesting, and I think that's possible. There are commitments, of course, with this view of faith. But I think, would you say that that characterized your view of faith fairly well?
I think, yeah, it was fairly accurate. Yeah.
Okay.
I've got another quote. This one comes from Albert Einstein, probably a name that's about as synonymous with science as any name could be, at least here in the United States. Einstein said this in an autobiographical work that he wrote late in his life. He said, "Science can only ascertain what is, not what should be, and outside of its domain, value judgments of all kinds remain necessary." Science can only ascertain what is and not what should be, and outside of its domain, value judgments of all kinds remain necessary. So Einstein seems to have the view that we need a lot more than science, and I'd invite both of you to react to that. And also I have this question as well. I'm wondering what you think the relationship is between science and the discovery or the identification or the creation of meaning and value and purpose in the world.
Well, I think, the way that Einstein sets things up is actually the way that most scientists, I would say, view things. So there's this line of demarcation for science beyond which there's just not, that's just not us. We don't do that. And that does have to do with these questions of, okay, well, this is what is and what ought to be is not our job. That's one way to say it. But somewhere around there, scientists say, well, this is where I get off the train. And I think this is a problem in terms of the way that we think about things and the way that we compartmentalize things. I already gave one bit of survey data for the MIT students, but I'll give another one, which is, they also gave, at one point, an incoming survey to the students, and they said, well, you've got 7 people who are all going through kidney failure. You have 3 kidneys to, 3 good kidneys to give out, and the ones who don't get the kidneys are going to die. And they say, so who should you give the kidneys to? And almost every single incoming MIT student says the same thing: roll the dice. Right? You just sort of, flip 7 coins, and come up with 7 numbers. Whoever has the highest 3 numbers, they get the 3 kidneys. And then you say, well, but it turns out that one of these people is a pedophile, the other one's the president of the United States, and they're like, well, definitely don't give it to the president. You start giving all these, and they're like, oh, well, then you shouldn't do random chance. There should be some other way of doing these kinds of things, and so there is this complete disconnect, because we make this artificial line in the sand between the disciplines that, oh, well, there's no way that any of these scientific, decisions I make could ever have anything relevance to what ought to be. I couldn't possibly know that. But I think that there is, I think Michael said this in his previous answer, which is I think there are ways that the scientific evidence we gather informs, our choices about what ought to be, and that we have to be engaging. This demarcation in our brains that, okay, well, this is science and this is not, is actually fairly harmful to making those kinds of decisions, because you usually are either operating in science mode, in which case you don't really think about the values, or thinking in values mode, in which case you don't necessarily think about the science. And it's like, well, you need both of these things.
Can you offer an example of a place where scientific evidence informs your ethical judgment?
Well, so in this particular case, part of it is just scientific evidence. In like the kidney example, it's like, well, you want to weigh things like, well, how likely are the people to actually survive if I give them the kidney? Are these people, change their ways so that they're not going to kill off another kidney? What are, and you need to know what types of behaviors to look for, and what types of things are likely to, if they've made changes, are they likely to keep those changes? I would like to, statistical studies that say that, people who, have kidney failure because they, because of their diet, they can change their diet, but they almost always switch back. You say, well, then, this is, a problem. Or if it, so you have to, there are ways that scientific information would inform the moral decision you make, although, I'm not sure on Albert Einstein's statement there, does the scientific data actually change what I think ought to be? I'm not sure. That's actually would actually be a pretty strong statement to be if you said, okay, give me enough scientific data that I'd say, oh, well, now I think I've changed my mind. I don't really think that.
Could you repeat the Einstein quote again, or I can
Sure
read
can,
it?
yeah. Well, I'll read it for the audience. Science can only ascertain what is, not what should be, and outside of its domain, value judgments of all kinds remain necessary.
There's something to be said about that. I did say that there is there's more of a relationship between science and value in my earlier question. However, this is something that is called the is-ought distinction. For example, the guy who's holding up the signs for me, I forgot your name, okay? Science can tell me all day that if I kick him in the shins, I don't really want to do that. If I kick him in the shins, it's going to send some sort of pain signal up to his brain. And science can tell me that he's going to try his best to avoid it at all cost. Curiously enough, science doesn't actually tell me not to kick him in the leg, okay? You can give me all the is claims you want. Tell me about the way the world currently is. It's a sad fact. Here I'm going to do a little science. Unfortunately, there are people doing bad stuff to people all around the world right now. That's the way the world is. It doesn't say the way the world ought to be in this regard. So yes, there is always going to be something that science can't speak to, okay? And of course, I have a vested interest in thinking that way since I'm a philosopher. Leave me a little left to do. But I leave you with this one last thought. And if you find that this coincides with your views and faith, all the better for you. But imagine we actually get done with science. Science is done. Got no more science done. In fact, you know, Troy comes out and says, I'm done with science, drops the microphone and leaves. It's all figured out. Would we still have questions? Here's one I have. How was it that science was so darn good? That's a question that science itself can't answer. There's always going to be some more questions. As long as there is, then science can't put the cap on it. There's always going to be values and other stuff going on.
All right, before we open it up to the audience for questions, I'd like to give each of the conversation partners an opportunity to ask the other a question. So either of you have a question you'd like to ask?
So I had one question, which was I was really intrigued by the fact that you brought so much back to relationships in terms of building meaning and those kinds of things. Because certainly in my experience, the relationships are very important. And they're particularly also important both in terms of maintaining those things, that's a value and something that brings meaning and purpose, but also in the sense that relationships are actually important in determining, in me determining what I actually believe is true. That, if somebody tells me something, it depends who told me whether I'm going to believe it. So you said, if Nate Silver says it's 95% likely that Donald Trump's, or that Washington's going to go blue, then, you believe it in part because it's Nate Silver. But if if somebody just walks up and, says, oh, 95% likely Washington's going to go blue, you'd be like, I'm not sure that I believe you. And so, considering the source, the relationship you have with that person, the experience you have with that person, goes into evaluating whether you think the thing is true. And so, in particular in the case of morals and ethics and good and bad and these kinds of things, I wonder how that factors in, because it seems to me like your code of ethics and morals and values and that kind of thing just comes from an abstract source of sort of what's good and what's bad. And for me, that has that intrinsically has less weight than the relationships that I'm trying to hold up with it. And so I wonder how you motivate following that ethical code, or where you get that ethical code from. Particularly if the people that you're trying to relate to might sometimes tempt you to not behave ethically.
Well, usually the first time I teach any sort of ethics class, I like to say, well, ethics is hard for a variety of reasons. One reason is it's not always that easy to figure out what's right. For example, most of the ethical theories that we actually considered, the people who came up with the ethical theories, the major ethical theories, largely speaking, like Kantianism and utilitarianism, were both Christians. And the reason they came up with these theories is they looked at the Bible, and they just started discovering that there were things that were not explicitly addressed in the Bible. They said, well, should we work 6-year-olds in a dangerous factory 14, 16 hours a day. It's not in the Bible. It doesn't say anything actually in the Bible about that. So what they did is they tried to develop a way to actually come and determine what the right or wrong thing is that could be in accordance with what they thought the moral laws handed down by God were. Now, I think that there's something about that reason. That's how we determine sort of what's right or wrong, whether we're Christian or not, especially like Facebook bullying. Unfortunately, the Bible says nothing about that. Now, I went all this way because I wanted to say this is how I can figure out what's right or wrong, this abstract notion that Troy was talking about. His question is, what motivates me? Part of it is, in some ways, is a relationship with myself in a lot of ways. Now, it's not that I want to make myself happy, okay, or anything like that, but it is a little about I think that I should be the sort of person that I could be proud of. Now, that went a long way, right? But I think I should be the sort of person I could be proud of. I'm not quite there all the time. None of us are. I mean, I think everybody in this room could agree we all fall short of that on a regular basis. And in fact, I believe everybody in this room would agree, except for perhaps one other human being, no other human being in existence has ever met that standard. But it's such a good standard to aim for. It's why a lot of the things you do, just getting to the next level in Halo, why do you do that? It's because it's a goal there. And I'm going to go ahead and say, to be the sort of person that I could be proud of is a more important goal than getting to the next level in Halo. And that's what motivates me.
You have a question for me?
Do you have a question for Troy?
Actually, I do. So, I was very curious about your notion that when you look to the world, you find a lot of symmetry. And you start looking at that symmetry and you say, aha, this is yet further evidence that there is this divine being. And you know what? I think to myself, evidence of evidence is in some ways evidence. Troy and I have developed a relationship. As he pointed out, Troy tells me he's got evidence, religious experience, I take, of some sort. Evidence is evidence in this regard. And it seems that you're appropriately connected in that way. And it seems like this is a natural human trait in some ways to start seeing this in a particular way. I guess, have you met somebody else in the faith, and perhaps in science, that didn't quite get the same result from that? And does that give you any pause about that feeling in this regard? So I guess I can kind of understand that feeling, even though I don't have it, because I've been in foxholes, I've looked up at the starry sky. I haven't had that feeling that there is something greater that's conscious. I guess, how do you know that the tenets of your faith actually, that they're the right ones? I'm just imagining the Christian faith, there's a lot of diversity there. How does that work?
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of questions there. So, are there folks who I've met who were people of faith, who were scientists who didn't have the same experience of science? There was one piece, and then another piece was, how do I evaluate the sort of belief claims or the faith claims, given, how do I know they're right? That kind of thing. Right? There's sort of two questions. Am I getting that?
Yeah. I guess it's you got it mostly, but I'm guessing, how does this faith inform the tenets of your own faith, and how reliable do you feel
right.
they are?
So, and then this has to do with personality types, and so there are certainly folks who are actually much further down the line in terms of how much scientific investigation for them reinforces their faith-held beliefs. I'm, given that I'm up here giving a, Veritas Forum talking about science and faith, you might be shocked that I'm not much of an evidentialist. I'm much more aware of the fact that I believed before I had all of the evidence. That's how I am about science as well, though. I very often am an intuitive scientist. I think this is going to be true. I don't really know why I think this is going to be true, but I think it's going to be true, and so we're going to do a whole lot of work to verify that this is true. I mean, sometimes I'm wrong. I think this is true and it's not right, but it's how I approach science. It's also how I approach faith. Is I have some inkling that something is true, and I pursue it. And sometimes I come to the conclusion, actually, never mind, that inkling was wrong because of X, Y, and Z. But I definitely have a sense that it's, for me, belief first and evidence second. Not in a, say that and it sounds bad, right? Belief first and then evidence second. I'm just going to go look for the evidence that supports my belief. It's more that the belief motivates me to look for evidence, either way, for or against the proposition. So that's my motivational point. In terms of how I approach things, I definitely, I see your point, which is okay, well, I had some beliefs in advance, and then that caused me to look for some form of either confirmation or rejection of those things. So that's sort of my process on things. There are people that I know that are much further towards the evidential side that they resisted being Christians for a very, 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 very long time until eventually they're like, look, there's just overwhelming evidence here. I can't deny this anymore. I yield. And then there are other folks who are, other way down the spectrum. So I think there certainly are, different experiences people have with this kind of thing. So that is, I think, certainly true. I don't think that it's universal for everyone that they say, yes, I have the same experiences with this. And then in terms of, you said, how do I evaluate faith claims? Well, I'm always thinking about. I'm always thinking about them, and both in the small and in the large. Okay, well, have I been deceived? Have I deceived myself? Have I really examined other faith traditions and contemplated what they're about? And of course, I haven't spent as much time thinking about other faith traditions, but I certainly have. I certainly think that I have at least said, okay, well, is this, if there's some core few things that I really, really think that I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure about these few things, and then you sort of go across and say, okay, well, now let's look at different faith traditions. Which ones could this be consistent with? So, yeah.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to open it up to the audience for any questions that you may have. I don't think we have. Do we have microphones for the audience? I don't think we do.
Mics.
Oh, we do.
There's other on the
And
sides.
there's one.
I just got the sound guy pointing to the sides.
One of the mics is there, and then this one will come down.
So if you're willing, go ahead and move to either the microphones there, or I think there's going to be a microphone over here shortly. That way we'll get your question loud enough for everyone in the room to hear you.
How's it going? I have a question for Dr. Goldsby. You say you strive to be the person you ought to be, and I feel like that's a very innate characteristic of all human beings, that I'd call it a conscience. So from an atheistic standpoint, where does that innate sense of right and wrong come from? You say you ascribe it to your relationships around you. But even if my mom tells me that something is wrong, if I believe it's right, I'm going to believe it's right in my own conscience. So where does that innate sense that everybody has, where does that come from an atheistic standpoint?
Interesting. So he just made the claim, and it's a good claim, and I think this claim is right. So you made the claim that, isn't it interesting that we all seem to have sort of the same moral views. In fact, there's a famous Christian philosopher slash theologian, also writer of children's books, called C.S. Lewis, that made an argument similar called the moral argument. Okay? And the moral argument is something like this. You start looking around at different cultures all around, and you start to notice that there are similarities between these cultures. And in fact, it seems that surprisingly, despite like the claims made by cultural relativism in some regards with regard to ethics, for example, no culture on earth says it is okay to kill somebody without a really good reason. None. This is something that's universal to us. And actually, I start thinking about that, and you say conscience. I say, I just want to be able to look myself in the mirror in some regards. Where does this come from? Well, it might not be satisfying to you if you're a person of faith, but I'm going to say the question you asked is the same sort of question you'd ask, why do I have hair on the top of my head and not elsewhere? Well, it's due to a long series of mutations, adaptations, etc., through millions of years, that even my trait for a conscience was developed as a product of evolution. So that's going to be my answer in this regard, because I think all people do have that. And there are mutations that suggest some don't, right? Perhaps sociopaths, maybe they don't have that thing. They're mutations that somehow survive despite that mutation. So, evolution.
Thank you.
Let's go over here. I'm going to alternate back and forth between the microphones.
Yeah, Dr. Goldsby, I have a question for you, kind of along the same lines, but I do kind of want to ask you to answer the question that you declined to answer at the beginning, which is, why are we here? And so let me frame it this way. Your meaning is derived based on how other people value you. Your meaning as a child was based on your parents valuing you, and so forth, up the hierarchy. But then the next question that I'm hoping to get answered is, why are we here? As in, looking around at everyone here, where would our value come from? Other than just the horizontal.
Okay, well, see, the thing is, let me go ahead and say, I want to clarify a couple things. I didn't say that my meaning developed from value given to me by my parents, okay? It's actually something that supervenes on the relationship and the fact that I do have parents, okay? So it's completely different. It's not like we're humans giving value to each other. I hold that there is something objective that arises out of this, that, if you will, sort of emerges. Like hydrogen and oxygen, two hydrogen, if I screw this up, let me know. Two hydrogens and oxygen, they have like this Mickey Mouse sort of look, in the standard thing. Doesn't look like water at all, but there's this emergent property of water. So my notion of meaning and value is an emergent property of the fact that I have those relationships. Now, why are we here? This is where I'm doing what is called an iterative induction. You ask each one of us, you each go through that same thing, and you have those same questions. Why am I here? Well, you go back 9 months, date night. Yada, 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 and you run through the whole thing, okay? And as far as the vertical thing, I think it's already a given. It's not going to be satisfying, but I deny the vertical thing, right?
Sure. So would you say that humans have meaning in the same way that rocks have meaning? Rocks touching each other, have a relationship with each other just from the physical forces?
No, not at all.
What's the difference?
And here's why. It turns out we humans value relationships in a certain way. Now, I said we're not adding value, okay? But there's a lot of things that are important. One, I have the ability to feel pleasure and pain. Pain sucks. Pleasure, a little bit better. Okay? Just insofar as I have that, that means the relationships I have that much more meaning, with regard to obligations in my relationships. I cannot cause pain to this nice person up here who is holding me my signs. okay? This is something I can't do. And that's the difference between me and him and two rocks. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's switch over to this microphone.
My question's for Troy. Do you believe that you'd be able to reconcile any meaning in a life separate of religion and of your religious faith?
Do I think I would be able to reconcile any meaning?
Would you find meaning in, say, in a life of atheism that's driven from your work as a chemist?
I think there are certainly some pieces of meaning in chemistry that I could find meaning in, apart from any theistic points of view. I mean, certainly there are ways that the things that chemists do, as long as they're not poisons and pesticides and those kinds of things, there's some things that chemists do that are really quite good in terms of helping people and making their lives better. And I think that you don't necessarily need to have you don't need to have necessarily any transcendent view of the world in order to recognize that there is some meaning or some value in that. There may be some added meaning or added value if you have a theistic viewpoint, but certainly I think an atheist could find value or meaning in those things.
Thank you.
Switch over to here.
Hi, I don't remember your names, but I have a question for the Christian chemist.
Troy. I'm Troy.
Hi, Troy. My question is, so every time a new scientific discovery is made that goes against your religion, do you mold your religious beliefs, or do you just drop the fact of this, I guess, the scientific fact? And if you, I guess, mold your beliefs, sorry, just lack of a better word, at what point of molding do you think strays too far from the religion?
Right, so that's a really good question. I think it touches on, I think, a fear that a lot of people have about how science and Christianity, on both sides, fit together. And I would characterize it, that fundamentally the beliefs of Christianity aren't the kinds of things that science is ever going to prove or disprove. There are certain ways that I might interpret Scripture. I might take Scripture, interpret it, and say, okay, well, this is what I think it's saying here. But those types of interpretations are secondary. They're not the Scripture itself. It's me saying, okay, well, if I put this piece together with this, and I do this, this is where I end up. And so, for example, it's without a doubt true that, well, not without a doubt, but almost certainly true that 1,000 years ago, most Christians, in fact, almost every person, thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. And that was just people saying, okay, well, I look at this. Maybe they were using Scripture, maybe they were just saying, well, if you look at it, it looks like it's the center of the universe and everything's orbiting around us. But nonetheless, it seems like what just about everybody thought. However, it wasn't really a central tenet of faith. It wasn't actually spelled out explicitly, the Earth is the center of the universe, you must believe this. That wasn't anywhere. It was just sort of taken for granted. Everybody thought it. And then some scientific data came along that said, well, maybe that's not really the best way to think about the universe. And then that caused people to say, oh, wait a minute, let me look back here and see what this says and try to figure out what's going on. And so I don't fear, in any sense, scientific discoveries sort of conflicting sort of at ground level with Christian beliefs. However, I think there are ways in which scientific discoveries can have very specific things to say about ways that we might interpret some of the sacred texts in Christianity.
Thank you.
We're going to switch over here for one last question, and then I'm going to give Troy and Mike an opportunity to make a final closing statement. So this will have to be the last question. But actually, if you can stick around, Mike and Troy have agreed to stick around as well after the formal event is over, so we can continue some of these conversations. But this will have to be the last question for now from the audience.
Hi, thanks for being here. So I have a few questions, but I'll just touch on one. So you mentioned in your cosmic significance, this is for Michael, our minds don't have access to the plan meaning this divine, obscure realm that's outside of our natural reality, but there's a lot of philosophers out there, Thomas Aquinas for one. He talks about reason to faith and how there's multiple laws that kind of establish the natural world, the natural realm, and the divine realm. So could you, first of all, describe your definition of access and what that means, having the accessibility to this plan, and whether that, what is that? Does that mean being blind to Scripture, being blind to Christ? What does that look like for you?
Okay, so actually, this is a reason I think that we can't have access, and actually I think it might be heretical to think you might have access, because the divine plan of God has got to come from an infinite mind. Don't we agree with that, right? I have a finite mind, so there is a sense in which I can't know everything that God does, okay? This is a fact. I mean, if there is a God, I can't know everything that God does, okay? Now, here's the reason I think we don't necessarily have access. That's one reason, but it's not alone. There's something I didn't bring up. It's called the problem of evil, okay? And the problem of evil is, this is the problem. God is typically attributed 3 O's. That's omniscience, he knows everything. Omnipotence, he can do everything that's logically possible. Don't try to play the can God make a rock he can't lift. It doesn't make sense. Okay? And he's omnibenevolent, meaning he's perfectly good. Those 3 claims are consistent, but you add the 4th one in that says evil exists, and it seems like they're inconsistent. So what you've got to do is, a lot of people will resort to something called free will and say, well, free will is actually what causes the evil to exist. And there's a way out of this, and fair enough. But then there's this stronger argument. It's called the evidential argument of evil. You can go, yeah, okay, so I can understand why there's some evil, free will. But then I start to look at things like the Holocaust and the suffering in, say, South Sudan, etc. And I can multiply this 100 times. And at some point I go, yeah, we get that free will is good. God, why don't you come in and fix some of this, right? It looks really bad. Why did God allow that to happen? And one thing that I think is reasonable, perhaps, for someone to say is something like, it is, all things considered, once you look at the very big picture, good. This is something that a lot of people will resort to. My colleague, I have a colleague who says, no, that's not a good plan, but you know what? Maybe you can actually say that. But the thing is, from my perspective, there's no way I'm going to have access to that plan. There's no way, from my very limited, finite perspective, can I look at the Holocaust and go, there's anything that was worth that? So that's the reason I don't think we have access to the plan. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right. In regards to your problem of evil...
I'm so sorry to do it, but I think we should probably... it's almost my bedtime, if nobody else has to go to bed. So I do want to give both of our speakers one last opportunity to make a closing statement and sort of 2 questions to briefly address as you make the statement. First of all, what do you hope that the audience would take away from tonight in terms of the conversation we've had tonight? And second of all, what would it take for you to change your mind about any number of things we've talked about tonight, but maybe in the grandest scheme about your basic commitments to Christianity, to atheism? You want to go first?
Yeah, I should go first, right? So you can get the last.
That's what we've been doing so
Yeah.
far.
If for something that I would hope you would take away, I hope that you take away a sense that the truth that we are talking about, the truth that you are seeking, is probably much bigger than you ever realized. These things are huge, no matter which perspective you come at them from. They are very big. And I think one of the things when you approach something big is that it's important to approach it with humility. I think one of the biggest obstacles to learning is arrogance. And so I think approaching these things humbly is really important. So I hope that you guys will be having conversations with each other that display that humility. And then in terms of what might change my beliefs. So I think beliefs are really, really strong and really, really powerful things, both for good and for bad. And so you ask the question, well, what could possibly change my beliefs? There's only one thing that can change my beliefs, and that's another belief. And that's actually the situation. And I think that's actually, that only occurred to me like the day before yesterday. But that, ultimately, if I was going to change, say when I'm now, I have this belief in God, say something else is going to cause me to not believe in God. It's not going to be just evidence. It's not going to be just facts. It's not going to be just something I learned. It's going to be something else that I believe that comes into conflict with that. So that would be, if there was some other thing that I said, look, I cannot let go of this thing. I have to believe this is true. And it's in conflict with the belief in God, and I have to give it up.
All right, I am actually going to answer him in reverse order since he just talked about what would cause him to give up his beliefs. And actually, this is a very difficult question, so I can understand where Troy was coming from. There's something called the Preface paradox in philosophy. So imagine I take every single one of my beliefs and I put them on a page. This is going to be a big book, right? I have a lot of beliefs, okay? If you ask me, is there one of those pages that says something false? With near certainty, I can say yes. Because there's so many. Even if I'm 99.9% reliable, I probably have at least 30,000 beliefs. That means I'm going to have a lot of false beliefs there. The problem, and I'm nowhere near that good, I might add, right? I'm not 99.9% reliable. Whereas that's the case, when I look at each page and I look at each particular belief, and this is what Troy was talking about, it's real hard to say that right there, that is the belief. That's the one that's false. Every one seems eminently plausible. But nonetheless, there is a way that I could change my mind. It could be that there is this thing called faith, which is a reliable belief-producing process. And perhaps when you have your religious experience, you feel that thing. I'm blind to that, okay? So that's a problem for this view, but I don't have it. For whatever reason, my makeup doesn't have it, okay? I look at the starry sky and I just go, cool, like we talked about before, okay? Now, it's interesting, though, there are people who feel this way. And I said evidence of evidence is evidence. So there is some sense in which I have some evidence in favor. But I have a defeater for that evidence. That defeater is, there are a lot of people that believe in the divine, but they disagree very vehemently about the divine. Okay? Now that says to me that maybe this thing isn't reliable. But if all of a sudden I woke up tomorrow and everybody who believed in the divine started actually agreeing better, because, I mean, there's radical differences in these beliefs. One God, 20 gods. If they started agreeing a little better, that actually might be some evidence that there is something real, this faith thing, that is actually real. Now, as far as the other question, what do I want you to take away? Well, one, it turns out now that I've mentioned I'm an atheist, I have no chance of ever becoming president. You guys are not going to vote for me, okay? So one thing I'd like to do is point out, no horns. I don't eat babies. Okay? I'm a moral person. I want you to also think about the Christian side, okay? It's not, those of you who are more in my worldview, it's not the case that Christians are completely and totally irrational, right? They're not. They're well-meaning, thoughtful people like me. We can actually be reasonable and disagree, even though one of us is wrong. That's all I got.